In the spring of 53 BC, 7 Roman eagles crossed the Euphrates River. They belonged to the richest man in Rome. They would not come home for 33 years, and no soldier would bring them. For 500 years, Rome had swallowed nearly everything it touched. Carthage, Greece, Egypt, Gaul, every rival that stood and fought, sooner or later, broke. Except one. East of the Euphrates stood an empire most people today cannot even name. No marble forum, no famous speeches. A kingdom of horsemen whose own records crumbled into dust, whose story was written almost entirely by their enemies. And yet for 3 centuries they did what almost no power in Rome's world could do. They told Rome no, and they made it stand. Tonight we cross the river ourselves. Into Parthia. Dim the lights. Get comfortable. The eagles are waiting on the far bank. Chapter 1. The people with no country. Every empire has a birth certificate of some kind. A founding city. A first king. A date carved into stone. Parthia has a problem. Its birth certificate was written by other people, long after the fact. In languages the founders never spoke. So before we meet the empire that stopped Rome, we should be honest with each other about something. Almost everything we know about the beginning of this story comes to us second-hand. The Parthians wrote very little about themselves, and most of what they did write has not survived. What survived instead were the accounts of Greeks and Romans, people watching from the outside, often with reasons of their own to shade the truth. That is not a weakness in the story. That is the story. Keep it somewhere in the back of your mind tonight, because it will follow us all the way to the last chapter. Here is what the sources tell us. Sometime in the middle of the 3rd century BC, on the great sea of grass that stretches from the Caspian toward the heart of Central Asia, there lived a nomadic people called the Parni. They were one tribe within a larger confederation known as the Carrhae, horse people of the steppe, herders and raiders, who moved with the seasons and measured wealth in animals rather than land. The settled world to their south did not think much of them. To the Greek kingdoms that had inherited the empire of Alexander the Great, the Parni were background noise, a smudge of dust on the northern horizon. To the old Persian families of the Iranian plateau, people with deep roots and proud memories of the empire of Cyrus, these northerners were outsiders, not Persians, not civilized, not anyone's idea of future rulers. That is the first great irony of the night. The empire that would one day stand eye to eye with Rome was founded by a people that even their future subjects considered foreigners. Now, let us put the world around them in order, because the rise of Parthia makes no sense without it. When Alexander died in 323 BC, his generals tore his empire apart. The largest piece, a vast territory running from the Mediterranean coast to the borders of India, fell to a general named Seleucus. The kingdom he founded, the Seleucid Empire, was in theory one of the mightiest states on earth. In practice, it was a giant with a circulation problem. Its heart beat in Syria, in cities like Antioch near the Mediterranean, but its limbs stretched thousands of miles to the east, across mountains and deserts, held together by roads, garrisons, and the loyalty of appointed governors. Loyalty, at that distance, has a short shelf life. One of those distant provinces was called Parthia, and here we need to clear up a small confusion of names, because it matters. Parthia was originally just a region, a stretch of land southeast of the Caspian Sea, with its own settled Iranian population. The Parni were not from Parthia. They were the nomads next door. History would eventually blur the two together, and the newcomers would take the name of the land they seized. The conquerors, in a sense, were renamed by their conquest. The man at the center of the founding story is called Arsacid. According to the Roman historian Justin, who was summarizing a much older work by Pompeius Trogus that is now lost, Arsacid was a chieftain of the Parni, a man, in Justin's words, of uncertain origin, but proven courage. The Greek geographer Strabo gives a similar picture, though he admits that even in his day the accounts disagreed about where Arsacid came from. Some said he was a Bactrian fleeing trouble further east. Others said he was simply a steppe leader who saw an opening. When the ancient sources themselves shrug, honesty requires us to shrug with them. We do not really know who Arsacid was before the moment he steps into history. But we know the opening he saw, around the middle of the 240s BC. The Seleucid Empire was distracted by a war with Egypt and by a power struggle inside the royal family. Out on the eastern frontier, the imperial grip loosened. The governor of Parthia, a man named Andragoras, decided the moment had come to stop being a governor and start being an independent ruler. He broke from his Seleucid masters. It was a bold move. It was also, for him personally, a fatal one. In declaring independence, Andragoras had cut himself off from imperial protection while sitting next door to a hungry steppe confederation that had been watching the borderlands for years. The traditional date is 247 BC, the year the Parthians themselves would later treat as the beginning of their royal era, though scholars still debate exactly which event that year marks. Within a few years of that date, Arsacid led the Parni south off the steppe and into the settled lands of Parthia. Andragoras was defeated and killed. The province that had just declared independence from one master discovered it had simply been claimed by another. A rebel governor murdered by a nomad chieftain in a remote province. If you had been standing in Antioch, or Alexandria, or Rome, which in those years was busy fighting Carthage for control of Sicily, this would not have made the news. Nobody in the Mediterranean world looked east in 247 BC and felt the ground shift. And yet something genuinely unusual had just happened. And it is worth slowing down to see it clearly. Most conquerors who came off the Eurasian steppe followed a familiar pattern. They raided, took what could be carried, and either went home or dissolved into the population they had conquered within a generation or two. The Parni did something different. They kept their steppe identity, the horses, the archery, the mobility, the loyalty of clan to chief. But they also kept the province. They learned to govern farmers and townspeople. They adopted local administration where it worked. Slowly, pragmatically, they began to become a state. Justin preserves a detail that tells you how they wanted to be remembered. Arsacid, he writes, was revered by the Parthians the way Romans revered Romulus. As a founder almost beyond criticism, every king who followed him on the Parthian throne for nearly 5 centuries took the name Arsacid as a royal title, the way Roman emperors would later take the name Caesar. That is why historians call the dynasty the Arsacids. One man of uncertain origin became the permanent mask of an entire royal line. Think about what that means for us. Lying here more than 2,000 years later, trying to see these people clearly. The Parthians turned their founder into a title. The Romans turned their enemies into stereotypes. And the Parthians' own version of events has almost entirely vanished. We are looking at a kingdom through 2 veils at once. But through those veils, the outline is unmistakable. By the time Arsacid died, sometime around 217 BC, if the reconstructions are right, the Parni had a capital, a royal era on the calendar, a dynasty, and a foothold on the great east-west roads of the Armenian plateau. They were no longer the people with no country. They were small. They were surrounded. The Seleucid kings had not forgotten them. and in the decades ahead. Seleucid armies would march east more than once to crush the upstart kingdom, and would very nearly succeed. The new rulers of Parthia could not know any of that yet. They knew horses and grass and the weight of a bow in the hand. They knew that the settled world to the south was rich and divided and slower than it believed itself to be. The wind still moved over the steppe they had left behind. To the west, far beyond their sight, Rome was rising. The two of them would not meet for another century and a half. There was no hurry. There is no hurry now. The grass bends. The horses graze. The story has begun. Chapter 2. Stealing an Empire in Slow Motion. Stand for a moment on the walls of Seleucia on the Tigris, sometime in the 150s BC, and look down with the eyes of a Greek garrison soldier. Below you is one of the largest cities on earth. River barges, unloading grain and dates at the quays. Brick warehouses, 3 stories high. Their doorways, breathing out the smell of wool and bitumen and spice. A market where you can hear 5 languages before breakfast. Greek, from the colonists. Aramaic from the farmers and scribes. Persian from the hill country. Arabic from the desert traders. And now and then, something else. A clipped northern speech you do not recognize. Spoken by horsemen who come to buy iron and salt and leave without bargaining. Your grandfather came out from Macedonia with a land grant and a spear. Your father served on these same walls. You were born within sight of the river, and you have never seen Greece. And the pay is late again this month. The rumor in the barracks is that the king is fighting his own cousin in Syria, 1,000 miles away, and that the eastern satrapies have stopped sending soldiers entirely. Last week an officer rode in from the highlands and would not say what he had seen there. Only that the post stations past Media were empty. You are standing inside a giant that is quietly bleeding to death. And those horsemen in the market have noticed. This chapter covers more than 100 years, and it asks you to feel the slowness as part of the story. There is a kind of conquest historians love to write about. The lightning campaign. Alexander breaking an empire in 3 great battles. Parthia did not rise that way. Parthia rose the way water rises in a basement. Slowly, patiently, and only where the structure had already cracked. When we left them, the Arsacids held 1 remote province and the goodwill of nobody. The Seleucid kings still regarded the entire east as stolen property, and they took the threat seriously. Around 230 BC, King Seleucus II marched east to deal with the nomad problem personally. The details are thin and the sources disagree. But the rough shape is this. Arsaces fell back onto the steppe. The campaign bogged down. Trouble erupted back home in Syria. And the king turned around. The first lesson of Parthian survival had been written. You cannot corner a people who can simply ride away. A generation later came a far more dangerous test. Antiochus III, the most capable Seleucid king in a century, led a massive army east around 209 BC. This time the Parthians could not just vanish. Antiochus took their cities, pushed them hard, and forced their king to terms. And here the Parthians showed a second survival skill, one that is easy to mistake for weakness. They bowed. The Parthian king accepted vassal status, kept his throne, and let the great king march away to other wars. A proud people, you might think, would have fought to the end. The Parthians understood something colder and more useful. An empire that cannot stay is an empire you only have to outlast. And then the outside world did Parthia an enormous favor. In 190 BC, at a place called Magnesia in Western Asia Minor, The army of Antiochus III was shattered by a power from the far side of the Mediterranean. Rome, the same Rome that will spend the second half of tonight locked against Parthia, made Parthia's rise possible. The peace terms after Magnesia stripped the Seleucids of territory, ships, and treasure, and saddled them with a crushing war debt. To pay it, the kings went east, robbing their own temples. One of them, Antiochus III himself, was killed doing exactly that, cut down by a mob while plundering a sanctuary in Elymais to fill his Roman indemnity. The giant with the circulation problem now had a broken spine as well, and it was pawning its own gods. Watch what happens to a weakened empire on a frontier full of patient neighbours. Province by province, the Seleucid East began to peel away. Bactria, in the far east, went its own way under Greek kings. Persis stirred in the south. Local dynasts in Elymais and Carrhae started minting coins with their own faces on them, which in the ancient world was how you announced that you no longer expected to be punished. And in Parthia, at almost exactly the right moment, the right man took the throne. His name was Mithridates, the first Parthian king of that name, and he reigned for roughly 40 years, beginning around 171 BC. If Arsacid founded the state, Mithridates the first founded the empire. Justine, again preserving the older history of Pompeius Trogus, treats him as the great architect of Parthian power, and modern historians largely agree with that judgment. His method was the method of the rising water. He did not march on the Seleucid heartland. He waited for its eastern holdings to come loose, and then he caught them. First came Media, the broad highland country of western Iran, rich in horses, sitting astride the great road that connected the Iranian plateau to Mesopotamia. The fighting took years, and the sources give us almost nothing of it except the result, which is its own kind of eloquence. By around 148 or 147 BC, Media was Parthian, and, once you hold Media, the road runs downhill, in every sense, to the richest prize in Western Asia, Babylonia, the ancient land between the rivers, old beyond memory even then, dense with cities, canals, farmland, and trade. In 141 BC, Mithridates entered Seleucia on the Tigris, the giant city where our garrison soldier stood watch a few minutes ago. The gates, as far as we can tell, were not battered down. The city, unpaid and unprotected by its distant kings, came to terms. Cuneiform tablets from Babylon. The astronomical diaries kept by temple scholars, who recorded kings the way they recorded eclipses, acknowledge the new ruler in that very year. Those clay tablets give us a rare, precious anchor of certainty in this often blurry story. Empire lie. Eclipse records do not. A century earlier, the Parni had been herding animals on the northern grass. Now their king ruled Babylon. The Seleucids tried to take it back. The young king Demetrius II marched east a few years later, won early victories, and was then defeated and captured. What Mithridates did with him tells you everything about how Parthian power liked to work. He did not execute the captured king. According to Justin, he treated him honourably, gave him a Parthian noblewoman as a wife, and kept him at court for years. A dead king is a martyr. A captive son-in-law is a tool, and a message to every Greek city in the new empire about what kind of masters had arrived. And on his quines, Mithridates I did something just as calculated. He called himself Philhellene, friend of the Greeks, in Greek letters, to reassure the millions of Greek-speaking subjects he had just absorbed. The message was simple: your cities are safe with us. Your markets will stay open. Your councils may keep meeting. The grander title, the old Persian one, the one that claimed the inheritance of Cyrus himself, was not his yet. That claim belonged to the next great reign, and we will watch it being made in the next chapter. Mithridates the first died around 132 BC. Old and victorious, he had stolen an empire in slow motion, one falling piece at a time, and he had done it so patiently that the world barely understood what now stood between the Euphrates and Central Asia. Rome, in that same decade, was burning Carthage and breaking Greece. The two powers still had not met. The space between them was closing like a slow tide. On the walls of Seleucia, the watch changes. The new garrison answers to a different king, and the pay, for now, arrives on time. Down in the market, the same 5 languages argue over the same scales, because good rulers know that the first duty of conquest is to change as little as possible. The rivers of Babylon run quietly under the new flag. They have seen empires before. They will see more. The water rises. The night deepens. We continue. Chapter 3. The King of Kings and the Two Worlds. Before the empire could meet Rome, it nearly died. This is the part most retellings skip, and skipping it is a mistake, because what almost killed Parthia also proves how tough the structure really was. In the decade after Mithridates I died, the disaster came from the direction the Parthians themselves had come from, the steppe, far away in Central Asia. Whole nations were in motion, pushed westward, in a chain reaction that, remarkably, had been set off at the other end of the continent by the wars of Han China against its nomad enemies. Displaced peoples, among them the horsemen the sources call the Saka, came pouring into the eastern Parthian lands. 2 Parthian kings in a row, Phraates II and then Artabanus I, marched east to stop them. The sources report that both kings died fighting, one after the other, within a few years, around the 120s BC. Stop and feel the size of that. 2 kings of kings, killed in battle back to back, the eastern provinces overrun. While in the west, Babylonia wavered and local rebels stirred. Most ancient states did not survive one catastrophe like that. Parthia absorbed 2 and lived. The man who pulled it back from the edge gives this chapter its name. Mithridates II came to the throne around 124 BC and reigned for more than 30 years. Later, tradition called him the Great, and for once the nickname is earned. Patiently, region by region, he restored what had been lost. He pushed the nomads back in the east and settled some of them in a province that would carry their name for centuries afterward. Sakastan, a name that survives to this day in the region called Sistan. He reasserted control over Babylonia. He pushed Parthian influence west until it touched the upper Euphrates and reached into the politics of Armenia, taking an Armenian prince named Tigranes as a hostage for good behavior. A detail that will matter enormously later tonight. And it was he, the coins and inscriptions tell us, who reached back past the Greeks, past the Seleucids, into the deep memory of Iran, and took the title the dynasty would carry forever after. King of Kings, the title of Cyrus and Darius, a declaration, stamped in silver, that the Arsacids were no longer successful intruders. They were the heirs of Persia. Under this king, for the first time, Parthia touched both ends of the earth, and I want you to see both meetings, because together they are the hinge of the entire night. Look east first. Picture a camp on the edge of the Iranian world, somewhere in the dry country, beyond the last Parthian towns. Early morning, perhaps around 120 BC or a little after, a column of travellers is breaking camp. Men in quilted coats. A Chinese envoy among them. Part of the missions that followed the great journey of Jiang Qian, the explorer whose reports first told the Han court that organized empires existed in the far west. The Chinese historian Sima Qian, writing within living memory, recorded what those missions found here. A vast, settled country, the Chinese called Anxi. The name itself probably an echo of Arsacid's. Walled cities. He wrote, cultivated fields. Merchants who travelled by cart and boat to neighbouring countries. Silver coins bearing the face of the king. And then the morning light moves. And the envoy hears it before he sees it. Hoof beats. Not a patrol. A horizon of them. The Han Chronicle records that when a Chinese embassy approached, the Parthian king sent 20,000 horsemen to the eastern border as an escort of honour. Allow yourself to stand inside that for a moment. An ambassador from one end of the known world, watching an honour guard the size of a field army ride out of the dust to welcome him. Hooves drumming the dry ground. Banners and bow cases. The smell of horse and leather rolling ahead of them like weather. The Parthians understood theatre. Within a few years, gifts and envoys were moving in both directions, and the caravan routes that later ages would call the Silk Road began, in an organized way, to flow through Parthian territory. That is the Eastern meeting. 20,000 horsemen, sent as a courtesy. Now look west, because the other meeting is smaller, stranger, and far more ominous. In 96 BC, or close to it, a Roman official arrived on the banks of the upper Euphrates. His name was Sulla, a rising politician and soldier, a man who would one day march his legions on Rome itself and rule it as dictator. He was in the east on provincial business, and a Parthian ambassador named Orobazes came to meet him. The first formal contact between the two powers that we know of. The Greek biographer Plutarch, in his life of Sulla, preserves what happened, and you should hear it with Parthian ears. Sulla had 3 chairs set out, one for the king of Cappadocia, a Roman client, one for Orobathus, the envoy of the king of kings, and one for himself. In the middle, in the seat of honour, as if Rome were the judge, and the 2 Asian powers were petitioners standing before him. A chair. That is all it was. A piece of furniture arranged with intent. On a riverbank. At the meeting of 2 worlds that knew almost nothing about each other. Plutarch adds 2 endings to the scene. Some Romans, he says, criticized Sulla for arrogance, and the Parthian king, when he learned how his ambassador had allowed Parthia to be seated as an inferior, had Orobazes executed. Nothing else happened. No var. No treaty worth the name. The 2 empires looked at each other across the river, filed their impressions, and turned back to their own troubles. But the pattern of the next 300 years is already sitting in those 3 chairs. Rome assuming seniority over everything it meets. Parthia answering insult with cold fury. And the Euphrates in between. Put the 2 meetings side by side now, because this is the thought to carry out of the chapter. In the same generation, one empire received China with 20,000 horsemen and met Rome over a rigged seating chart. Parthia now stood at the centre of the inhabited world, the only great power in direct contact with both of its giants. That position would make Parthia rich beyond counting. It would also place Parthia permanently in the path of Roman ambition. Mithridates the Great died around 91 BC, and the empire he restored would soon stumble into a generation of internal weakness. It hardly matters tonight. The shape of the world was set. Far to the east, Silk was moving west in slow caravans, bale bi bale, toll by toll, far to the west. A Roman was remembering a riverbank, and how easy it had been to take the middle chair. The two worlds had touched. Sleep is allowed to come whenever it wants to. The story will keep. Chapter 4. How Parthia actually worked. Hold an image with me before anything else in this chapter, because everything in it, and almost everything after it, hangs on this image. Rome was a pyramid, stone on stone, law on law, every block cemented to the next, all of it pressing down toward one center, magnificent, rigid. And if you could somehow shatter the center, the whole mass came down. Parthia was a tent, a great tent of the steppe, the kind the ancestors of the Arsacids had lived in for 1,000 years. The king of kings was the center pole. But a tent does not stand on one pole. Around the center stood the other poles, and the fabric of the empire stretched across all of them together. Push on a tent from outside, and it gives way, then springs back. Knock loose a pole, and the fabric sags, but holds while the pole is set again. A tent survives storms that bring stone walls down. It has exactly one enemy it cannot survive. We will meet that enemy at the end of the night. For now, let us walk through the tent and name the poles. Begin with a confession the Romans would have found absurd. The King of Kings did not directly rule most of his own empire. Beneath him were entire kingdoms that kept their own thrones. Media Atropatene in the northern mountains, where the king's mountain fortresses guarded passes that snow closed half the year. Carrhae down, where the rivers meet the Persian Gulf. Fat on harbour tolls, its little kings growing rich on every ship that came up from India. Elymais in the hills, with its famous temple treasuries. Osruna in the west, an Arab dynasty astride the caravan fords, and more besides. Their rulers minted coins, kept courts, raised troops, and bowed to the Arsacid as vassals. Beside them stood something even more important, the great noble houses of the Iranian plateau, clans whose names echo through this entire story. Houses like Suren and Carrhae. These families held enormous hereditary estates, commanded their own private armies of retainers and armoured horsemen, and regarded themselves not as servants of the crown, but as partners in it. The tradition preserved a detail about the house of Suren that tells you everything. Its head held the hereditary right to crown each new Parthian king with his own hands. Sit with that. The dynasty itself, at the most sacred moment of royal power, depended on a family it did not control. The center pole was raised, every single reign, by one of the other poles. Where did this king actually live? The answer is everywhere, and that is not an evasion. The court moved with the seasons, in the old steppe manner, between several capitals, a slow royal migration of wagons and grooms and falconers and scribes, thousands of people and tens of thousands of horses flowing across the plateau twice a year like a tide. Nisa, up near the homeland of the first Arsacids, a royal city of treasuries and shrines. When archaeologists opened its storerooms in the 20th century, they found two kinds of treasure lying in the same ground, and together they are a portrait of this empire. The first was paperwork, thousands of administrative notes scratched on broken pottery, deliveries of wine from named vineyards, in a Parthian script, the daily bookkeeping of a working kingdom. The second was splendor, a hoard of magnificent carved ivory drinking horns, griffins and goddesses spiraling around their rims, receipts and write-ins, bureaucracy and banquet. That is Parthia in a single excavation. Ekbatana, high and cool in the Median mountains, served for summer, and in the west, on the banks of the Tigris, the winter seat that grew into the greatest city of the empire. Ctesiphon has a story of its own. It began, the geographer Strabo tells us, as little more than a camp, set up by the Parthians directly across the river from the giant Greek city of Seleucia. The Parthians did not storm Seleucia and did not raze it. They settled in across the water and let the two cities grow toward each other. The Greek metropolis of merchants and the royal seat of the horsemen, facing each other across the Tigris like the two halves of the empire's mind. Strabo even preserves the official explanation that the kings wintered there out of consideration, so that the Greek city would not have the steppe army quartered on it. Courtesy, with 40,000 horses standing behind it. Before this night is over, Roman armies will burn parts of both cities more than once. For now, let them stand in the dark, lamplit, busy, and at peace. Who lived inside this tent of an empire? Almost everyone, speaking almost everything. Greek citizens in the cities the Seleucids had planted, still electing their councils, still holding their festivals, still suing each other enthusiastically in Greek. Aramaic-speaking farmers and scribes across Mesopotamia, heirs of Babylon, whose temple astronomers went right on, recording the heavens in cuneiform under their third dynasty in a row. The same patient families of scholars whose eclipse diaries gave us our anchor date in Chapter 2. Persians in the south, with their long memory. Jews in large and ancient communities, who, it is worth saying plainly, generally found Parthian rule far gentler than what their cousins would experience under Rome. Arab traders along the desert edge. Nomads inside the eastern frontiers. Cousins and former enemies of the dynasty itself. The kings made no serious attempt to melt all this into one people. On their coins they wrote Greek. In their courts the Iranian languages lived on. Surviving documents from the empire come down to us in multiple tongues, sometimes side by side in the same archive. A contract in Greek stacked with receipts in Parthian. The empire did not ask its peoples to become Parthian. It asked them to pay their tolls, send their levies, and stay loyal, mostly. For centuries, they did. A Roman senator would look at all this and see weakness, and the Greek and Roman writers said so, just in among them, sneering at an empire of tribes and chieftains, play acting as a great power. No uniform law, no professional bureaucracy worth the name, no standing army. Because when war came, the king summoned the nobles, and the nobles brought their horsemen. Each contingent, loyal first to its own lord. An army, the Romans would say, that you had to negotiate into existence before you could even march it anywhere. But every design pays for its strengths, and you have already seen the price hiding in the structure. If the great families crown the king, the great families can unmake him. If every noble house commands its own army, then every disputed succession is a civil war waiting for a spark. The same looseness that made Parthia unkillable from outside made it permanently vulnerable from inside. File that away in the drowsiest part of your mind. At the end of the night, that bill comes due. For now, the machine works. The caravans pay. The vassal kings send tribute. The wine deliveries are logged on potsherds at Nisa. Vineyard by vineyard. Year by year. The court moves with the seasons. North in summer. South in winter. The way the herds once moved on the steppe. A tent, not a pyramid. Poles and fabric, holding against the wind. In the next chapter, the wind learns to shoot back. Chapter 5. The Arrow and the Armor. Somewhere, on the plains of Iran. Around 2,100 years ago, a boy is learning to do something that should be impossible. He is riding at a full gallop with no stirrups. Because stirrups have not yet reached this part of the world. He grips the horse with his knees alone. His hands are occupied, both of them, with a bow, and at the moment his instructor calls out. He twists his entire upper body backward, against the motion of the horse, and shoots at a target behind him. He will miss for years before he hits. He has time. He has been on horseback, in some sense, since before he could walk. That backward shot became famous enough to enter the languages of his enemies. The Parthian shot, fired in retreat, at the enemy who believes he is winning. Many believe that centuries of English speakers slowly wore the phrase down into the parting shot. The cutting remark delivered on the way out the door. Language scholars still argue about whether the two expressions are truly parent and child or simply became entangled along the way. And honesty makes us say so. Either way, the picture survives. The horseman, leaving, turning, striking one last time. This chapter is about how Parthia fought, and I want to be direct about why it matters. You cannot understand the next chapter, the one every lover of Roman history has been waiting for, unless you first understand that the Parthian army was not a worse version of the Roman army. It was an answer to a completely different question. The Roman question was, how do we take and hold ground? The legion was the finest ground-holding instrument the ancient world ever produced. Disciplined, heavy infantry. Professional, drilled to lock shields and grind forward. Backed by engineers who could bridge rivers and break cities. Close with the enemy. Break him. Occupy what remains. The Parthian question was older, and it came from the steppe. How do we win without being caught? The answer had two parts, and the sources. Plutarch and Cassius Dio chief among them. Let us reconstruct both in detail. The first part was the horse archer. Light, fast, barely armoured, carrying the composite bow, a weapon laminated from wood, horn, and sinew, short enough to use from the saddle, and powerful enough at close range to punch an arrow through a shield. Horse archers did not charge. They orbited. They flowed around an enemy formation the way water flows around a stone, never closer than they chose to be. Shooting, wheeling away, shooting again over the horse's tail as they went. Against them, infantry faced a miserable arithmetic. Chase, and you exhaust yourself and break your formation. Stand, and you are a target that has agreed to stay still. The second part was the cataphract, if the horse archer was the wasp. This was the battering ram, a big horse, bred for weight, armoured in scale or mail across its chest and flanks. On its back, a nobleman sheathed head to foot in iron, carrying a lance so long and heavy the sources give it its own name. The contis, a polearm held in both hands. Cataphracts were expensive beyond reason, which is why they were aristocrats. The noble houses of the last chapter turned into weapons. They did one thing. They waited until the enemy was disordered, pinned, or wavering, and then they came on, in a thundering close-order charge, meant to crack a formation the way a hammer cracks shell. Wasp and hammer, neither, alone, was unbeatable. Horse archers, without a finishing weapon, could harass an army forever without destroying it. Heavy lancers, without preparation, died on the spears of steady infantry. The Parthian art, and it was an art, lay in the timing between the two. Sting until the shield wall buckles and the ranks compress in fear. Then break what the arrows have softened. And there was a third weapon, less famous, that good commanders on both sides came to understand was the deadliest of all. The land itself. Parthia's western approaches were sun-hammered plains and semi-desert. Poor in Vata, endless in horizon. A legionary marched into that country carrying armor, weapons, rations, and tools. 60 pounds, and more on his back. Under a sun he was rarely bred for. Toward an enemy who declined to stand still. The horse archer carried a bow and a water skin, and his supply train ran on grass. Out here, logistics was not a support service. It was the battlefield itself. Fairness requires the other side of the ledger, because tonight is not a fairy tale about invincible horsemen, and the sources are clear about the limits. The Parthian system was terrible at sieges. You cannot shoot a city wall into surrender from horseback, and Parthia never built an engineering corps to rival Rome's. The system also struggled to stay in the field. Noble levies wanted to go home to their estates. And ancient writers noted that Parthian armies tended to dissolve as campaigns stretched on, and every horse army carried a clock that ran against it. Arrows run out. The day, the quiver's empty. The wasp loses its sting. Keep that one detail with you. Like a small stone in your hand. The arrows always run out. In the next chapter, the question of whether the arrows will run out is going to decide the fate of 7 legions. And the answer is going to arrive on the backs of 1,000 camels. So picture the two systems side by side one last time. In the calm, before we let them collide. The legion, a wall of iron that wins by closing the distance. The Parthian host, a storm of horn and hide that wins by refusing to let the distance close. Each nearly perfect within its own logic. Each, in the other's country, nearly helpless. For 60 years after Sulla's 3 chairs, the two systems grew in parallel without ever testing each other. Rome conquered the eastern Mediterranean, swallowed kingdom after kingdom, and convinced itself the pattern would simply continue across the Euphrates. Somewhere on the Iranian plains, the boy on the horse grew up and taught his sons the backward shot. The wasp and the hammer waited in the tall grass. The wall of iron was coming. Let your breathing slow now. The river is ahead of us, and beyond it, the desert. Tomorrow, in story time, is the year 53 BC. Chapter 6. Carrhae. The richest man in Rome wanted one more thing. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus, and by the year 55 BC he owned, by some accounts, a meaningful fraction of the city of Rome itself. He had made his fortune in silver mines, in slaves, and in burning buildings, which he bought cheap while they were still on fire. He had crushed the great slave revolt of Spartacus. He stood with Caesar and Pompey as one of the 3 men who quietly ran the Roman world. It was not enough. Plutarch, whose biography of Crassus is our richest source for everything that follows, says that what gnawed at him was comparison. Pompey had triumphs. Caesar was carving glory out of Gaul. Crassus had money, and money, in Rome, was the one form of greatness that did not quite count. He was around 60 years old. If he wanted a conqueror's name, it had to be now, and the only unconquered direction was east. Here is the detail that should unsettle you. Parthia had given Rome no cause. There was an understanding at the Euphrates, reached within living memory. Senators stood up in Rome and said plainly that this war was unprovoked. Plutarch records that as Crassus marched out of the city, a tribune named Ateus ran to the gate and pronounced a formal, smoking curse on the expedition. Romans retold that curse for generations. Because of what came next, we should be more careful than the Romans were. Curses do not destroy armies. Decisions do. Watch the decisions. In the spring of 53 BC, Crassus crossed the Euphrates with roughly 7 legions and supporting cavalry. Somewhere in the region of 40,000 men. The accounts say his officers urged him to follow the river south, keeping water on one flank and supply boats within reach. An Arab chieftain, whom the sources accuse of secretly working for Parthia, urged the opposite. Strike east, straight across the open plain, and catch the Parthians before they could gather. Crassus chose the plain. Now shift your eyes to the other side of the field, because the man waiting there is one of the most remarkable soldiers in this entire 1,000-year story. The Parthian king had split his forces. He himself took the main army north to punish Armenia for siding with Rome. The defense of Mesopotamia he handed to a nobleman of the house of Suren, the same family that held the right to crown kings. The sources call him simply Shurena. He was, Plutarch says, still in his 30s, tall, almost disturbingly beautiful, and the second man in the empire after the king. Shurena brought no infantry worth mentioning. He brought about 10,000 horsemen, 9,000 of them archers, 1,000 of them armoured cataphracts, and he brought the idea that won the battle before it started. A camel train, 1,000 animals, loaded with nothing but arrows. Remember the small stone you have been holding since the last chapter. The arrows always run out. Shurena had looked at the single weakness in his own system and removed it. The armies met near a town called Carrhae, in the flat, shadeless country of Upper Mesopotamia. In the early summer of 53 BC, what follows is reconstructed from Plutarch and from the historian Cassius Dio, and for once the two accounts largely agree. The Parthians appeared first as a thin, unimpressive line. Shurena had hidden his cataphracts behind the front ranks, their armour draped in cloaks and skins. At his signal, the covers came off, and the Roman army found itself staring at a wall of mirror, bright iron. Men and horses sheathed in metal, under a sound the legionaries had never heard. Not trumpets, the deep rolling thunder of the Parthian war drums, hung with bronze bells. A sound Plutarch describes as something between beast and storm, a sound felt in the chest before it reaches the ears. Crassus formed his army into a huge hollow square, and the storm began. The horse archers did not charge. They circled the square and poured arrows into it, and the Roman shields, built to stop blows in close combat, did not fully stop them. Arrows pinned hands to shields. Arrows nailed feet to the ground. When the legionaries locked shields over their heads in the famous testudo, the tortoise formation, the cataphracts came forward at a slow, deliberate walk, picked their moment, and drove their lances into the shell. When the Romans opened ranks to fight back, the lancers withdrew, and the arrows resumed. The legions endured it the way veterans endure, by counting toward the one mercy every army before this one had granted them: evening and empty quivers. An arrow storm is survivable if it ends. Then, through the dust, they heard the camels coming up. It is one of the quietest terrible moments in ancient literature. No charge, no war cry, just a supply column, 1,000 camels swaying forward under bales of fresh arrows, and 40,000 men understanding, at more or less the same instant, that the storm had no end, that the arithmetic of the day had been decided weeks earlier, in a logistics decision, by a man they had never met. Crassus ordered his son Publius, a decorated young officer who had served with Caesar in Gaul, to take a mixed force of cavalry and infantry and drive the archers off. The Parthians in front of Publius turned and fled. He pursued, exactly as he was meant to, far out of sight of the main army. Then the fleeing archers wheeled. The trap closed, and the cataphracts came in. Publius, and his force were destroyed. Plutarch says the Parthians rode back toward the main Roman square with the young man's head raised on a lance, close enough for his father to recognize. I will not dress that moment up, and I will also not flatten the man. Crassus, by every account, mastered himself in front of the army, riding the lines, telling his men the loss was his alone to grieve. Whatever we think of the war he started, he met that hour like a Roman officer. The army held until dark. Night gave the survivors one chance, and here discipline finally cracked. The retreat to the town of Carrhae became a stumbling, fragmented flight. The wounded left where they lay. In the days that followed, the remnants tried to break out in separate columns. Some made it. Most did not. The end came at a parley. Sharina invited Crassus to negotiate terms. His own soldiers, exhausted and close to mutiny, essentially forced him to go. What exactly happened at that meeting will never be known. The sources themselves admit confusion, but a scuffle broke out, and Crassus was killed, a story repeated by later writers. Cassius Dio, and the Roman historian Florus among them, claims the Parthians poured molten gold into the dead man's mouth, a comment on his famous greed. Even in antiquity, that detail was beyond verifying, and we should treat it as what it probably is, a legend too perfect to resist. The verifiable facts are terrible enough. Out of roughly 40,000 men, the sources estimate 20,000 died and 10,000 were captured, marched east, and resettled deep inside the empire. 7 legionary eagles, the sacred standards themselves, went to Parthia as trophies, measured in lost standards. Carrhae stands among the very worst defeats in all of Roman history. Besieged Cannae and the Teutoburg forest. Plutarch closes with a scene even he relays with a kind of stunned irony. The head of Crassus arrived at the Parthian court while the king was watching a performance of Greek theatre. A play by Euripides. The actor, the story goes, took up the head as a prop and delivered his lines over it. The richest man in Rome ended as a stage property. In a tragedy written in the language of Athens, performed at the court of the horsemen his city had called barbarians. Let the battlefield empty now. Let the dust settle over the plain, and ask the quiet question this whole night turns on. What had actually been defeated at Carrhae? Not Rome. Rome would return. Hungria. What died at Carrhae was an assumption. The assumption that the Roman way of war, and behind it, the Roman way of empire, worked everywhere, on every ground, against every system, for 500 years. Closing the distance had been the answer. At Carrhae, for the first time, the distance refused to close. One more thing, and it tells you the difference between winning a battle and being allowed to have won it. Surena, the young genius who had just handed Rome its limit, was too bright a star for his own king's comfort. Within about a year, the sources report, the King of Kings had him put to death. The tent, remember, fears its own strongest pole. 7 eagles hung in a Parthian temple, gathering the smoke of foreign incense. Rome did not forget where they were. 33 years they would hang there. We are not done with them, but that is for a later hour. The drums have stopped. The plain is quiet. Breathe with it. Slow and slower. Chapter 7. The Counterpunch. Every student of Rome knows Carrhae. Almost nobody knows what Parthia did next. And the forgetting is not an accident. What Parthia did next does not fit the story Rome liked to tell about itself. And Rome wrote the books. So let us restore the missing decade. Because for a moment, and only a moment, the entire Roman East stood open. After Carrhae, Rome fell into the convulsion we remember as the civil wars, Caesar against Pompey. Then Caesar murdered on the Senate floor in 44 BC, and his heirs and assassins tearing the world apart all over again. Pause on a detail the sources preserve. In the last months of his life, Caesar was openly preparing a massive war of revenge against Parthia. Troops already gathering. The daggers of the Ides of March. Whatever else they did. Cancelled that war. Parthia was spared a terrible test by the most famous assassination in history. And Parthia knew it. And Parthia, watching Rome bleed itself, finally moved. In 40 BC, a Parthian army crossed the Euphrates the other way. It was led by two men. One was Carrhae, son of the king, a prince. The sources treat with unusual warmth. The other was a Roman. His name was Quintus Labienus. His father had been one of Caesar's best generals before switching to Pompey's side. And the son, stranded as a republican envoy at the Parthian court when his faction collapsed, made an extraordinary choice. He took service with the King of Kings. So the invasion of the Roman East came with a Roman face attached. Legion trained, marching under Parthian banners, minting coins that named him Parthicus, friend of Parthia. Rome called him traitor. He would have said Rome left him first. The success was stunning. Syria fell. The garrisons, full of old Republican soldiers, went over to Labienus in blocks. Parthian horsemen reached the Mediterranean coast. Cities that had paid Roman taxes for a generation watched the cataphracts ride in. In Judea, the Parthians swept into Jerusalem, deposed the Roman client government, and installed a king of their own choosing from the old priestly dynasty, a young Roman ally named Herod, not yet called the Great, fled for his life by night. For about 2 years, the eastern third of Rome's world simply was not Roman. Why did it not last? The honest answer comes in 2 parts, and the first is a man named Publius Ventidius, Mark Antony, who held the Roman East for the triumvirate, sent Ventidius to repair the disaster, and his story is almost too good. Ventidius had been led as a captive child in a Roman triumph decades earlier, when Rome crushed his Italian hometown. He grew up poor, supplied mules to the army, and clawed upward through Caesar's service. The aristocrats sneered at the muleteer. The muleteer then did what no consul had managed. He beat Parthia 3 times in a row. His method deserves a moment, because it proves a rule that will govern the rest of the night. Each system wins on its own ground. Ventidius refused every battle on open plain. He took high ground and made the Parthians come up slopes, where horses lose their speed and arrows lose their flat killing arc. And he met them at the crest with heavy infantry and clouds of sling stones, which the sources note could dent armor that stopped arrows. In 39 BC, he broke Labienus, who fled and was hunted down. In 38 BC, at a place called Gindarus, he shattered the main invasion army. Prince Pacorus died in the fighting. The grief in Parthia, the sources say, was real and deep, and it carried poison. The old king, who had now given a son to this war, fell into suspicion of his other sons, and the dynasty began to eat itself in exactly the way chapter 4 warned you it could. Syria was Roman again. The counterpunch had failed. But notice what Ventidius did next, because it is the second part of the answer. He stopped at the Euphrates. The one Roman commander who had actually solved Parthian tactics looked at the river and the desert beyond it, and declined to cross. The wall, he understood, ran both ways. Mark Antony did not understand, and so the decade ends with the lesson written a second time, in Roman blood again. In 36 BC, Antony gathered one of the largest armies Rome had ever pointed east. The sources speak of somewhere near 100,000 men, including allies, and invaded the Parthian Empire by a northern route, through the mountains of Armenia, aiming at Media. He was trying to avoid Crassus's flat plain, which was sensible. What he could not avoid was distance itself. His siege train, hundreds of wagons carrying the great rams and engines, crawled behind the army. The Parthians ignored the legions, fell on the wagons, and burned every machine. Antony reached the fortress city he had come for, and stood in front of walls he no longer had any means of breaking. What followed was not a battle. Parthia never gave him one. It was a retreat. 27 days, under arrow, fall, and winter, mountain cold. The army dissolving from hunger, thirst, and disease faster than from wounds. Plutarch, whose life of Antony preserves the ordeal almost day by day, reports tens of thousands lost, and records the grim affection of the survivors for a commander who at least kept discipline and kept moving. Rome dressed the campaign up afterward. The soldiers knew. The East had held a second time. Stand back now and look at the whole double decade, 53 to 36 BC. As one shape, Rome crossed the river and was broken at Carrhae. Parthia crossed the river and was broken at Gindarus. Two empires, each unbeatable at home, each helpless in the other's country, had run the experiment in both directions and gotten the same result. Two systems, one river, a wall invisible on every map, standing exactly where the grass meets the pavement. The next move, for once in ancient history, would not belong to the soldiers. Somewhere in Parthia, 7 eagles still hung in their temple, and 10,000 aging Roman prisoners watched the eastern seasons turn. In Rome, a cold-eyed young man named Octavian was finishing the civil wars and beginning to think, unlike any Roman before him, about what could not be conquered. The river runs quiet in the dark. The watchfires on both banks burn low. No one is crossing tonight. No one will cross for a long time. Let the current carry you a while. The drums are far away now, and growing farther. Half the story is told. The quieter half, the wiser half, is waiting on the other side of sleep. Chapter 8. The War Won Without a Battle. This chapter is the quietest in the whole story, and that is exactly why it matters. In the middle of a history full of drums and arrows, we are going to watch two empires do the hardest thing empires ever do. Nothing. When the civil wars finally ended, the Roman world belonged to one man. Octavian, soon renamed Augustus, had defeated Antony, taken Egypt, and closed the doors of the Temple of War. He was 33 years old, and he had inherited, along with everything else, a debt of honor that every Roman could recite. 7 eagles in Parthian hands, the bones of Crassus's legions unburied in the eastern dust. Poets of his own court, Horace among them, wrote lines about the shame of Roman soldiers living out their lives in the East, married to foreign wives, serving a foreign king. Public opinion expected the revenge war. Caesar had been planning it when the daggers found him. Antony had attempted it and failed. Now Rome had a single ruler with overwhelming resources, a unified army, and no rivals. Every voice in the forum assumed it was only a matter of time. Augustus looked east, did the arithmetic, and chose differently. To see why, you only have to count what we have already counted together. Carrhae had proven that legions die on the open plain. Antony's retreat had proven that even avoiding the plain, distance itself, supply itself, the sheer size of the country, could destroy an army without a single pitched battle. Augustus was many things, but he was never a romantic about war. He had also spent his entire adult life watching what happens to Roman rulers who need one more victory. So instead of legions, he sent pressure. This is the part the poets never put into verse, and it is a small masterpiece. For a decade, Augustus moved pieces around the edges of the board. He backed claimant after claimant in Armenia, the buffer kingdom both empires considered theirs. He welcomed and sheltered a rival claimant to the Parthian throne itself, because Parthia, true to the design of the tent, had fallen into another dynastic feud, and there was always a spare Arsacid in need of a sponsor. He let the Parthian king, a hard, capable, deeply insecure man named Phraates IV, sit with the knowledge that Rome could fund his next civil war whenever it pleased. And then Augustus put his stepson Tiberius at the head of an army and marched it, slowly and visibly, toward the east, not across the river, toward it. The message needed no translation. We do not want to invade you. We are perfectly happy to ruin you. In 20 BC, the deal was struck. Phraates IV returned the eagles of Crassus, the standards taken from Antony's failed campaign, and the Roman prisoners who were still alive and willing to come home. Men, now in their 50s and 60s, who had been captured as young soldiers 33 years before. In exchange, Rome recognized, in practice, if never quite in writing, what this whole night has been building toward. The Euphrates was the line. Beyond it, Rome's reach ended. No legion crossed. No one died. The eagles came home in a diplomatic pouch, so to speak. And here is the wonderful, very human part. Augustus sold it to the Roman public, as a conquest anyway. The coins struck for the occasion show a kneeling Parthian holding out a standard, with the legend, signs recovered, Augustus himself, in the great public inscription summarizing his life's work. The res gesta wrote that he compelled the Parthians to return the spoils and beg for the friendship of the Roman people. He built a magnificent new temple of Mars the Avenger in his forum and housed the recovered eagles inside it, as if they were trophies of war. The poets fell into line. The kneeling Parthian became a stock image of Roman art, repeated in marble and on silverware, even on the breastplate of the most famous statue of Augustus that survives today, the emperor in armor, and on his chest, a Parthian politely handing back an eagle. There is a thought here that reaches far beyond ancient history. We remember Carrhae because catastrophe makes a story. Nobody writes epic poetry about a treaty, but measured in lives, in stability, in everything that lets ordinary people plant a field and raise children. The quiet agreement of 20 BC was worth more than any victory either empire ever won over the other. The most successful day in 3 centuries of Roman-Parthian relations was a day on which nothing happened, and the peace held, not perfectly, and not forever, but for 2 full generations the river stayed quiet. Phraates IV even sent 4 of his own sons to live in Rome, officially as honored guests, in practice as insurance. Princes kept safely out of reach of Parthian succession politics, and useful to Rome as ready-made claimants if a future king misbehaved. Both sides understood the arrangement perfectly. Roman and Parthian envoys learned each other's protocols. Trade thickened along the river crossings, year by year. Bale, because that is the real story of the next 100 years. And it is the story of our next chapter. While the soldiers stood down, something else crossed the border in both directions. In volumes, no army ever matched. Silk going west, silver going east, and through every Parthian toll station, the wealth of 2 worlds, paying for the privilege. The eagles sleep in their new temple in Rome, under Italian stars. Home at last, and slightly embarrassed. The river runs unwatched for once, dark and easy between the empires. Far to the east, caravans are forming, bells on the camels, lamps in the dust. Follow them now. They know the way. Chapter 9. The Empire of the Middle. A city gate on the Tigris. Sometime in the 1st century AD, the hour before dawn, you hear it before you see it. Bells, hundreds of small bronze bells, swaying out of the darkness on the necks of camels. A caravan is coming in off the eastern road, 80 days or more out of Central Asia, and in the packs, lashed to those swaying backs, is a material that, at this end of the road, the sources suggest, traded for something close to its weight in silver. Silk, grown, spun, and woven in a country so far away that here, in Mesopotamia, it is barely more than a rumour with a name. China. This chapter is about the Parthia nobody fights. The Parthia of tolls and warehouses, of river barges and caravan inns, of a court that grew rich enough to shrug off lost battles, because the deepest truth about this empire is one the war chapters can hide. Parthia's real power was never the bow. It was the address. Look at the map in your mind. To the east of Parthia, beyond the deserts and the mountain passes, lay Han, China, the largest producer of luxury goods on earth. To the west lay the Roman Mediterranean, the largest consumer market on earth. Between them stretched thousands of miles of steppe, desert, and mountain, crossable only by the slow relay of caravans that later centuries would romantically name the Silk Road. And for almost the entire useful length of that road's western half, every camel, every bale, every merchant paid Parthian tolls, slept in Parthian towns, and weighed silver on Parthian scales. The middleman position was worth more than any province, and the Parthians guarded it with total clarity of purpose. The proof is one of the strangest stories of the ancient world, and it comes to us not from Greece or Rome, but from the Chinese court chronicles, the Hao Hanshu, the history of the later Han dynasty. In the year 97 AD, a Chinese general operating in Central Asia sent an envoy named Gan Ying west with instructions to do what no official Chinese mission had ever done. Go all the way. Reach the great empire at the far end of the road, the one the Chinese called Da Qin, which is Rome, and make direct contact. Gan Ying made it across Parthia to the shore of a western sea, probably the Persian Gulf. There, the chronicle says, the sailors of the Parthian coast told him about the crossing ahead. With good winds, they said, 3 months. With bad winds, as long as 2 years. Men take 3 years of provisions. The sea makes men homesick, and some die of longing. Gan Ying turned back, and the Chinese chronicle itself, compiled centuries later from Han records, is blunt about what stood behind the sailors' poetry. The kingdom in the middle, it states, wished to keep its grip on the trade in Chinese silk, and so it blocked the road between Rome and Han. The chronicler had no doubt about the motive. Whether those particular sailors were honest about the sea or performing the most profitable piece of travel advice in history, we cannot know from this distance. And it hardly matters. The result is on the record. The 2 largest empires on the planet never once established direct official contact, and the empire in the middle collected the difference for 300 years. Where did the money pool? Follow the bells to the twin cities. On the west bank of the Tigris, Greek Seleucia, with its hundreds of thousands of people, its city council, its workshops, facing it, Ctesiphon, the winter seat of the kings. Swelling decade by decade, from camp to capital, the Roman writer Pliny and the geographer Strabo give us the sense of scale, and archaeology fills in a dense world of river ports and market towns up and down Mesopotamia. A caravan road needs cities the way a river needs banks. We even have a route map. A short Greek text survives, written around the turn of the eras by a man named Isidore of Carrhae, called the Parthian Stations. It is nothing more than a list. The caravan stops across the empire from the Euphrates eastward, with the distances between them. A trucker's atlas, 2,000 years old. It may be the most boring document antiquity ever produced, and it is one of the most precious, because it shows you the empire as the merchants saw it. Not a battlefield, a sequence of wells, walls, and beds. Now walk in through the gate with the caravan, and listen, because the sound of Parthia is the sound of languages, layered on languages. Greek in the agora, Aramaic in the warehouses and the contracts, Persian and Parthian in the garrison and at court, Arabic along the desert edge, Hebrew and more Aramaic in the great Jewish communities of Babylonia, which under Parthian rule grew into one of the most important centers of Jewish life and learning anywhere on earth, a position they would hold for many centuries after Parthia itself was gone. Add the faiths, stacked as deep as the languages, the old gods of Babylon, still served in temples already 2,000 years old, by priests who also kept the astronomical diaries we met in Chapter 2, Greek gods in the Greek cities, the Iranian tradition of the prophet Zoroaster, tended by hereditary priests, the Magi, a word that has reached you before tonight by a very different road, and the god Mithra, friend of soldiers and contracts, whose name would one day, carried west and transformed almost beyond recognition, be whispered in underground shrines by Roman legionaries. Over all of it sat a court that had learned to enjoy what it taxed. Parthian art from this golden stretch survives only in fragments, but the fragments glitter, the carved ivory drinking horns of Nisa, sculpture in a new manner that broke with Greek habit and turned to face the viewer directly. Formal, frontal, great still eyes meeting yours. Music and poetry too. A tradition of court minstrels singing the deeds of heroes, which scholars believe carried the old Iranian legends forward, mouth to mouth, until they could be written down long after Parthia was gone. Here is the quiet argument of this chapter. And then I will let the merchant sleep. Empires advertise themselves with armies, but they live by their markets. Rome, in this same century, was bleeding silver eastward for silk and pepper and pearls, and Roman moralists hated it. Pliny grumbled, in a famous passage, about the fortune that drained out of the empire every single year to pay for Eastern luxuries. Parthia produced almost none of the luxuries in question. It produced location, safety, and a functioning road, and charged the world handsomely for all three. The bow stopped Rome at the river. The toll station made stopping Rome worthwhile. The caravan you followed in has paid its dues by now. The camels are folding themselves down in the courtyard of the inn, groaning, the way camels have always groaned. The merchant sleeps on his bales of silk. The money changer sleeps behind his locked box of silver. In the palace, across the river, the King of Kings sleeps in the middle of the world, with China at one hand and Rome at the other, both of them paying. It could not last forever. Nothing built on a border ever does. But it lasted a long, long time. And tonight, in the telling, it is allowed to last a little longer. The bells have gone quiet in the courtyard. Sleep now, if you have not already. The road will still be there. Chapter 10. The Armenian Question. Between every two great powers, there is always a third place. A land that belongs fully to neither. That both insist they cannot live without. And that pays the price for sitting where it sits. For Rome and Parthia, that place was Armenia. Find it on the map of your mind. A high, cold, mountain kingdom, wedged exactly between the two empires, north of the Euphrates line. Whoever held Armenia held the high ground over both Roman Syria and Parthian Mesopotamia. From the Roman side, an Armenia in Parthian hands was a loaded weapon aimed at the eastern provinces. From the Parthian side, an Armenia in Roman hands meant Roman armies camped on the rim of the Iranian plateau itself, past the desert barrier that had killed Crassus, past everything that made Parthia safe. Neither empire could swallow Armenia whole without war. Neither could let the other have it. And Armenia itself, a proud and ancient kingdom with its own language, its own nobility, and its own ideas, had no intention of being anyone's property. The result was a full century of crisis in which kings of Armenia were crowned, deposed, sponsored, poisoned, and replaced, sometimes by Rome, sometimes by Parthia, sometimes by their own exhausted nobles. Augustus and his successors managed the problem with the tools of Chapter 8, sponsorship and pressure. But a managed problem is not a solved one. And in the year 54 AD, it stopped being manageable. A new Parthian king, Vologases I, energetic and serious, did something blunt. He marched into Armenia and placed his own younger brother, a prince named Tiridates, on its throne. No pretense, no Roman approval. And Arsacid now wore the Armenian crown. In Rome, in that same year, the throne passed to a 16-year-old named Nero. You know that name for other reasons. The fire, the excess, the legend. But the Armenian War that filled the first decade of his reign was, on the Roman side, run with complete seriousness, because Nero's advisors handed it to one of the finest soldiers Rome ever produced. His name was Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, and our main source for what follows is the historian Tacitus, who wrote within living memory and had no patience for lazy legends. Corbulo arrived in the east and found the Syrian legions soft from long peace. Soldiers who had grown old in garrison towns without digging a trench, he marched them into the Armenian highlands and rebuilt them the hard way. Winter camps in mountain snow. Discipline enforced without mercy. Tacitus reports sentries losing limbs to frostbite at their posts. It is not a gentle story. It is what the Roman machine looked like when it was being resharpened. Years of grinding mountain warfare followed, and Corbulo proved the lesson of Ventidius all over again. On chosen ground, with rebuilt legions, Rome could not be stopped. He took and burned the Armenian royal cities. Tiridates fell back. By around 60 AD, Rome had installed its own client king in Armenia, and the matter looked closed. Then Rome overreached, and the war produced its second famous name. This one, an embarrassment. A new commander named Caesenius Paetus arrived, talking loudly about turning Armenia into an ordinary Roman province. He advanced carelessly, divided his forces, and in the winter of 62 AD allowed himself to be surrounded by Vologases at a place called Randea. Cut off and panicking, Paetus agreed to a humiliating capitulation. His legions marched out under Parthian eyes, abandoning their positions, and, the more hostile accounts claim, passing under a symbolic yoke. The ancient ritual of surrender. Tacitus, careful as ever, notes that the yoke story was disputed even then. and so will we. What no one disputed was the substance. A Roman army had surrendered to Parthia without a battle, and the East shook with the news. Now watch what happens next. Because this is the part that makes the Armenian War worth a chapter in a story about how two empires learned to live with each other. Corbulo came back, restored the military balance, and crossed the Euphrates in force. Vologases and Tiridates, for their part, had taken Rome's measure and wanted no Carrhae-sized gamble of their own. And so, on the very ground of the Roman humiliation, at Randia itself, the two sides met and built one of the most elegant compromises in the history of diplomacy. The formula went like this. Tiridates, the Arsacid prince, would keep the throne of Armenia. Parthia won the substance, but he would lay down his crown before an image of Nero, travel to Rome in person, and receive that crown back from the emperor's own hands. Rome won the ceremony. An Arsacid would rule Armenia as a Roman client, crowned in Rome. Each empire could tell its people, truthfully, that the other had bent. In 66 AD, Tiridates made the journey, and the sources, Cassius Dio and Suetonius among them, describe one of the great spectacles of the ancient world. The prince travelled overland for 9 months, with an escort 1,000 strong, magi and nobles in his train, and his queen beside him, feasted by the cities along the route. Dio records that the Roman treasury bore the cost of the procession at 800,000 sesterces a day, a figure ancient readers were clearly meant to gasp at, and gladly paid. In Rome, Nero staged the coronation in the Forum before the assembled city, the prince kneeling, the diadem placed, the crowd roaring, and then closed the doors of the temple of Janus to declare the whole world at peace. One more detail, small and oddly moving. Tiridates was a Zoroastrian, attentive to the purity laws of his faith, and the sources note the care he took, even while crossing a foreign empire, to bow before a foreign throne, to honour his religious obligations along the way. 2 systems of belief, 2 empires, 1 workable arrangement. And the arrangement worked. That is the point of Randia, and the reason it deserves to be remembered the way Carrhae is. The compromise held for roughly half a century. An Arsacid line ruled Armenia under Roman blessing for generations. After 100 years of coups and invasions, the two empires had finally found the only solution that ever really works between great powers. A formula in which each side wins something it can name, and each side knows exactly what it has traded away. It had taken a defeat apiece to make them wise. Carrhae, for Rome, for Parthia, the long proof that Rome always comes back. Wisdom, in empire, is rarely permanent. Sons forget what fathers paid to learn. We will watch the forgetting in the next chapter, but not yet. For now, in the high valleys of Armenia, the watchfires burn low and untroubled. Shepherds move flocks below, passes that no army will march through this year, or next year, or for 50 quiet years. A crown has crossed the world and come home again. In Rome, the temple doors are closed, and the god of beginnings and endings rests. In Ktesiphon, the King of Kings hears the report of his brother's coronation, and is satisfied. Let the mountains hold the peace a while. They have earned it. So have you. Breathe with the watchfires, low and steady and warm. Chapter 11. Rome breaks through, and breaks itself. Every long peace carries inside it the seed of its own ending, and the seed is always the same. A new generation arrives that remembers the glory and forgets the arithmetic. In 98 AD, the Roman throne passed to a soldier's soldier, a man born in Spain who had spent his life with the legions on the frontiers. His name was Trajan, and under him the Roman Empire reached the greatest size it would ever attain. E conquered Dacia, modern Romania, and filled Rome with its gold. He annexed the caravan kingdom of the Nabateans. He built like a titan the great forum, the markets whose halls still stand, the column with his wars spiraling up it in carved stone. And then, an old man by ancient standards, past 60, he turned east, toward the one frontier where Rome had agreed, a century and a half before, to stop. The official cause was Armenia, where the Parthian king had installed a new ruler without the Roman half of the Randeia ceremony. It was the kind of dispute earlier emperors had settled with envoys and pressure. Trajan refused the formula. The historian, Cassius Dio, our best source for the campaign, records the judgment that circulated even in antiquity, that the legal pretext was thin and the true motive was glory, the desire to stand where Alexander had stood. Modern historians still weigh the balance of motives. Strategy, economics, ambition, and honesty requires saying the question stays open. What no one debates is what he did. In 114 AD, Trajan marched into Armenia, deposed its king, and did what no Roman had ever done. He abolished the kingdom entirely and declared it a Roman province. The buffer that had absorbed a century of shocks was simply deleted from the map. Then he went further. In the following 2 years, his armies came down off the Armenian highlands into Mesopotamia itself, the heartland beyond the river. Cities that had watched armies pass for 3,000 years watched the legions arrive. Nisibis fell. Edessa opened its gates. Trajan's engineers carried boats overland in sections, bridged the rivers, and in 116 AD, the impossible headline swept the Roman world. Ctesiphon, winter capital of the King of Kings, had fallen to Rome. The golden throne of the Arsacids was carried off as a trophy. A daughter of the king was captured. Trajan took the title Parthicus, conqueror of Parthia, and the Senate struck coins showing Parthia as a Roman province. Dio preserves the famous scene of the aging emperor standing at last on the shore of the Persian Gulf, watching a merchant ship leave for India, and saying that if he were younger, he would have gone on. Like Alexander, it is the high water mark of the entire Roman Empire. On a map of that single year, Rome runs from the edge of Scotland to the Gulf. Hold the image. Now watch how fast it dissolves. Because what follows is the whole argument of this night, compressed into 24 months. Parthia had lost its capital. But remember the tent. There was no central thing in the Parthian system whose capture ended the war. The court withdrew east and the structure flexed. And then, with Trajan's armies stretched across hundreds of miles of newly declared provinces, every pole of the tent snapped back at once. Revolts erupted across the conquered cities behind the Roman front. The garrisons Trajan had left were besieged, cut off, in places massacred. A Parthian counterattack gathered in Media. Trajan, trying to stabilize an unraveling map, met his first outright failure at the desert city of Hatra, whose walls broke his siege in the heat. Dio describes the emperor himself, nearly struck by missiles while riding too close, the flies swarming every dish, the cavalry horses dying of thirst. It was at Hatra, more or less, that the conqueror's body gave out alongside the campaign. Trajan suffered what the sources describe as a stroke, began the journey home, and died on the road in 117 AD, in a small town in Asia Minor, with his Parthian war still burning behind him. His successor was his ward, and kinsman, Hadrian. And Hadrian's first significant act tells you what the professionals thought of the Eastern adventure. He gave it all back. Mesopotamia was evacuated. Armenia returned to its old status as a buffer under arrangement. Within a single year of Trajan's death, the Euphrates was the border again, exactly where Augustus had drawn it. The greatest conquest in Roman history had lasted, in any practical sense, about 2 years. You might expect the story to pause here, but the second half of this chapter is darker, and it begins 2 generations later, when Rome tried again, in 161 AD. A new Parthian king, Vologases IV, opened the old wound himself, striking into Armenia and destroying a Roman legion at a place called Elegeia, in the Armenian highlands. Rome answered with a full-scale war, waged in the name of the co-emperor Lucius Verus, with the real work done by hard professional generals. The pattern of Trajan repeated with eerie fidelity. Roman armies took Armenia, came down into Mesopotamia, and in 165 AD stormed and burned the twin cities, Seleucia and Ctesiphon, the second Roman sack in 50 years. Seleucia, the enormous Greek city that had opened its gates to armies before and survived, was destroyed so thoroughly this time that it never fully recovered. Parthia bent, gave ground, endured, as always. And then the soldiers came home, and they did not come home alone. The sources describe it beginning in the east, in the very years of the sack, then spreading along the army's roads and the trade routes into every province of the Roman world. The Antonine Plague. Modern scholars, reading the clinical descriptions left by the physician Galen, who saw it with his own eyes. Suspect, smallpox. Though the identification remains uncertain, and tonight we say so plainly. What is certain is the scale. The epidemic burned through the empire for years, returning in waves. Estimates of the dead run from several million upward. Ancient writers describe army lists gutted and cities emptied. Lucius Verus himself was dead within a few years, and his colleague was left to carry the empire alone. That colleague is a man you already know. Marcus Aurelius spent the rest of his life dealing with the consequences. The manpower shortages, the frontier crees, the long wars along the Danube, writing his private meditations by lamplight in military camps. If you have ever spent a night with his words, know that some of the weight pressing on them was this: part of the wider cost of Rome's Eastern victory. Now stand back, because the ledger of this chapter deserves to be read aloud. Slowly. Rome finally broke through the wall. Twice. It took the enemy capital twice. Something Parthia never once did to Rome. And the net result of the 2 great breakthroughs was a conquest that evaporated in 2 years. A buffer system shattered beyond real repair. A plague that may have killed more Romans than every Parthian arrow of 3 centuries combined. And a golden age that historians, with hindsight, often mark as ending in exactly these decades. Parthia, meanwhile, was bleeding too. Its richest cities burned. Its prestige cracked in front of every vassal and noble house. Its dynasty had now failed to protect the heartland twice in 50 years. The wall between the empires had finally come down, and it turned out the wall had been protecting both of them. Neither would outlive its destruction by long. Parthia had perhaps 60 years left. Rome's reckoning would take longer. But the long afternoon of the empire was over. The twin cities smoulder on the Tigris. The plague ships are already at sea, riding low, bells silent, and years from now, in a tent on the Danube, an emperor will dip his pen by lamplight and write to himself about loss and patience and how everything you love is only lent to you. Let that lamp burn for a moment, far away, while you breathe, in and out. Slow. There is no hurry in this part of the night. 2 empires are tired now. You are allowed to be tired with them. The next chapter is a funeral. But even funerals, told kindly, can carry you towards sleep. When you are ready, we will watch the tent come down. Chapter 12. Death from Within. Empires almost never die the way we expect them to. We imagine a final battle against the old enemy. Walls falling. A last stand. The truth is usually quieter and sadder. Most empires are not murdered. They are exhausted. And then replaced. Come back. One last time. To the image you have carried since chapter 4. Parthia was a tent. Not a pyramid. The king of kings was the center pole. The great noble houses, Suren, Carrhae, and the rest, were the other poles. And the fabric of the empire stretched across all of them together. That design had now survived everything history could throw at it for 400 years. Seleucid reconquest, steppe invasions that killed 2 kings back to back, Crassus, Antony, Trajan in the capital itself. The tent bent, and bent, and bent, and never broke. But a tent has one enemy: it cannot survive. I told you we would meet it before the night was out. The poles turning on each other. Here is the state of the empire in the years after Rome burned the twin cities for the second time. The treasury strained. Seleucia, the great money-making metropolis, half ruined. The plague that followed the Roman armies west had not spared the east either, as far as our thin sources let us see, and the dynasty itself had split. 2 Arsacid brothers, Vologases the 6th and Artabanus the 4th, both claimed the throne, minting rival coins, holding rival courts, each commanding the loyalty of some provinces and noble houses and not others. This was not new. The dynasty had survived a dozen such feuds. That was precisely the problem. Civil war had become a habit, and the structure no longer had the strength to afford its habits. And Rome, smelling weakness, kept coming. In the 190s AD, the Emperor Septimius Severus sacked Ctesiphon, the 3rd Roman sack within a century, carrying off, the sources claim, enormous plunder and tens of thousands of captives. A generation later, the Emperor Caracalla invaded yet again, and the accounts are ugly. He proposed a marriage alliance with the daughter of the Parthian king, and the historian Herodian tells it as a wedding turned ambush. The Roman party welcomed with feasting and then falling on their unarmed hosts. Cassius Dio tells the attack somewhat differently, but neither historian pretends it was honourable, and even Rome's own writers recorded it with distaste. Caracalla never finished his war. In 217 AD, he was murdered by one of his own officers on a roadside in Mesopotamia, and the throne was seized by his praetorian prefect, Macrinus. It was Macrinus, weeks later, who had to face the Parthian answer. Artabanus the 4th came west with the gathered fury of the insulted, and at the Battle of Nisibis in 217 AD, the Parthian army fought the Romans to a bloody standstill across days of fighting. Macrinus, unsteady on a stolen throne and needing peace at any price, agreed to pay Parthia an indemnity, the sources put at some 50 million in silver, and the war ended with Roman money flowing east. Notice the strange shape of that moment, because history pivots on it. On paper, Artabanus the 4th had just won the last great Roman war, standing over a battlefield with Roman silver on its way to his treasury. In reality, he was a king of half a kingdom, ruling burned cities, with a rival brother behind him, and 4 centuries of fatigue beneath him. Rome had never managed to kill Parthia, but 3 sacks in 100 years had done something in a way worse. They had demonstrated, over and over, in front of every vassal king and noble house, that the King of Kings could no longer protect the center of his own world. In an empire built on loyalty rather than bureaucracy, that demonstration was fatal. The poles of the tent were watching, and in the highlands of the south, in the province of Persis, one of them decided the center could be replaced. Persis was the old Persian heartland, the home country of Cyrus and Darius, the dynasty that had ruled the world 3 centuries before Parthia rose. Under the Arsacids, it had kept local kings, minor vassals among many, and it had kept something else, tended by its priests and noble families: memory. The memory of a world empire governed from exactly there, and a religious tradition, the faith of Zoroaster, whose guardians had never fully warmed to the easygoing, many-tongued, Greek-lettered style of the Arsacid court. Out of that province, in the 210s AD, rose a local ruler named Ardashir. The stories about his origins were written down much later, under his own descendants, and they are polished propaganda, so we hold them loosely tonight. What the coins and the contemporary Roman historians let us say firmly is this: Ardashir began swallowing neighbouring vassal kingdoms one by one. He refused the summons of his Arsacid overlord, and he raised the banner of something Parthia had never claimed to be, not a federation of kings under a first among equals, but a restored Persian Empire, centralized, sacred, and pure, with one crown and one faith at its center. Artabanus IV understood the threat and moved against him. The decisive battle came in 224 AD, at a place the later tradition calls the plain of Hormozdgan, and here the sources nearly fall silent, which is itself part of the story. For Carrhae, we have chapters of vivid detail: the drums, the camels, the dust. For the battle that actually ended the Parthian Empire, we have little more than the outcome, preserved in brief notices and in the victory monuments of the winner. History is written by people with reasons, and nobody with reasons was writing for the Arsacids anymore. The outcome was this: the Parthian army was defeated. Artabanus IV, the last Arsacid king of kings, died on the field. A relief carved into the rock at Firuzabad, cut on Ardashir's orders, shows the moment the way his dynasty wanted it remembered: Persian lancers unhorsing Parthian lancers, the new world knocking the old one out of the saddle. And then, the detail that proves everything this night has said about the tent: the noble houses did not fall with the dynasty. Most of them, reading the wind, simply transferred their loyalty. The house of Suren, the family that had destroyed Crassus, appears again in the records, serving the new Persian kings, as do the other great clans, holding their estates, leading their horsemen, surviving the empire they had once crowned. The poles stayed standing. Only the centre pole was exchanged. Within 2 years, Ardashir was crowned King of Kings in Ctesiphon, in the same winter capital, on the same river. The dynasty he founded, the Sassanids, would rule Iran for the next 400 years, and would fight Rome harder than Parthia ever had. So now you can see the final irony whole, the one that has been waiting in the fabric since chapter 4. The empire that stopped Rome was never stopped by Rome. The looseness that made Parthia unkillable from outside, the layered kingdoms, the proud independent houses, the throne that ruled by balance rather than command, was exactly what made it replaceable from inside. Rome spent 270 years and oceans of blood trying to break the tent from without, and failed every single time. One ambitious vassal, rising through the structure, precisely as the structure had always allowed, brought it down from within in a decade. The Romans watched the change with unease, and Cassius Dio, writing in these very years, said so. They were right to be uneasy. They had spent centuries learning to live with the tent. What replaced it was a pyramid, centralized, ideological, and aggressive, and the wars it would fight with Rome would make the Parthian wars look almost gentle. But that is another night's story. Tonight, an era is ending on a dark plain in southern Iran. In the year 224 AD, 470 years after a chieftain of uncertain origin led his horsemen off the steppe. The last king to bear the name, Arsacid, lies still among his cataphracts. The dynasty that outlasted Crassus and Antony and Trajan has run out of road at last. No Roman is anywhere in sight. The grass moves on the plain, the way it moved on the steppe at the beginning, before any of this had a name. The tent is down. The night goes on. One chapter remains, the quietest of all. The story of how an empire this large, this long, this consequential, was very nearly erased from human memory, and of what survived the erasing. Stay with me a little longer, or drift if you are drifting. Either way is right. The last lamp is lit. Chapter 13. The Empire that History Forgot. Here is a strange thing to do at the end of a story. Ask why the story was almost never told. Think of what you knew about Parthia before tonight. If you are like most people, including most people who genuinely love ancient history, the honest answer is almost nothing. Name. Maybe the word Carrhae. Maybe a half memory of horsemen shooting backward, and yet you have just spent an entire night inside an empire that lasted nearly 5 centuries, ruled the space between Rome and China, destroyed the army of the richest man in Rome, ran one of the great trade systems of the ancient world, and shaped everything that came after it in Iran and far beyond. 500 years of Roman history fills libraries. 500 years of Parthian history fits, in most general books, into a few pages. Why? The answer comes in 3 parts, and each part teaches something about how memory itself works. The first part is loss, plain and physical. The Parthians were not a bookless people, whatever Roman sneers implied. We have found the stubs of their paperwork, the ostraca of Nisa, administrative notes scratched on broken pottery, parchments from river towns, documents in several languages, but the heartland kept its records substantially on perishable materials. In a climate and a history that did not preserve them, no Parthian historian's work survives. Not one. Every connected narrative of Parthian history that exists today was written by outsiders. Greeks and Romans, mostly. And you have watched all night how that bends the picture. We met Carrhae through Plutarch. We met the kings through Tacitus and Dio. We met the empire's economy through a Chinese chronicle. It is as if the only surviving histories of the United States had been written in the capitals of its rivals. The second part is deliberate. The dynasty that replaced the Arsacids did not merely defeat them. Over the following centuries, the Sassanid kings and their priesthood assembled an official version of Iranian history, and in that version, scholars have long observed, the Parthian centuries were compressed, blurred, and shrunk, reduced in some later traditions to an interlude of petty kings between the glory of the ancients and the glory of the present. The great noble houses kept their private memories, and echoes of Parthian heroes seemed to survive, transformed into legend. In the later Persian epic tradition, where some scholars have argued that the famous hero Rostam carries the memory of the House of Shuren, but the official record was written by the victors of 224 AD, and they wrote their predecessors small. The third part is the quietest. Parthia fell between the world's great storytellers. To Rome, Parthia was the enemy, flattened into stereotype, decadent, treacherous, exotic. To later Persian tradition, Parthia was the awkward chapter between two properly Persian empires. To China, a trading partner at the far edge of report. Everyone who wrote about Parthia needed it to be a supporting character in someone else's epic. No one needed it to be the protagonist. Until tonight. That is not a small thing. And it is not flattery to say so. Every time someone learns this story, the erasure loses a little ground. So let us end by counting what survives. Because more survives than the silence suggests. The language of memory survives. Every time someone in English fires a parting shot, the horsemen ride again. Whether or not the old etymology is true, whether or not anyone in the room can name them, the roads survive. The networks Parthia organized and protected, the relay of goods and ideas between the Mediterranean and China, outlived the dynasty by more than 1,000 years, and the cities that grew fat on Parthian tolls handed their wealth down the centuries like an heirloom. The art survives, in fragment and in influence. That frontal style, figures turned to face you directly, with great still eyes, flowed out of Parthian workshops into the art of the Roman East. And some art historians argue that the thread runs further still, from those Eastern workshops into the icons of the Christian world, so that there may be a faint, real line between a Parthian relief and the face of a saint on a church wall. The claim is debated, as such long threads always are. It is enough, tonight, that serious people trace it. The armoured horseman survives. Rome itself, after 3 centuries of being hammered by cataphracts, began raising cataphract units of its own, and the heavily armoured lancer became one of the defining figures of the next 1,000 years of warfare across 2 continents. Whether the knight of medieval Europe is a true descendant or a parallel invention is still argued, and we say so honestly. But the first time Western soldiers ever stood and watched that future ride toward them was on a plain in Mesopotamia. In 53 BC, when the cloaks came off the iron, and one thing more survives. The proof, for 270 years, against the most relentless imperial machine the Western world ever produced. An empire of layered kingdoms and proud houses and borrowed alphabets held the line, not by being stronger than Rome, by refusing to fight Rome's war. The lesson sat there afterward for everyone who came later. Power is not one thing. There is more than one way to build something that lasts. We are nearly at the end now, so let the night close the way it opened. In the spring of 53 BC, 7 Roman eagles crossed the Euphrates and would not come home for 33 years. You know the whole of it now. The drums and the camels. The temple where they hung, gathering the smoke of foreign incense. The quiet deal that carried them west again in the baggage of diplomats, traded for a border. And the temple of the Avenger in Rome where they finally slept. The men who carried them rest in the dust of Mesopotamia. Roman and Parthian together, under the same plane, made equal a very long time ago. The empires that fought over that river are both gone. The language of the legions survives in fragments inside the words you are hearing now. The empire of the horsemen survives in fragments too. A name on the map of memory. A backward shot. A way of painting eyes. A story told at the edge of sleep. And the river is still there. The Euphrates still comes down from the mountains and crosses the old border country, past the buried roads and the toll stations sunk in silt. Indifferent now, as it was then to eagles and arrows alike. Somewhere on the far bank, in the country of memory, the horsemen are unsaddling for the night. The fires are small and warm. The horses graze in the dark. As they grazed on the steppe before any of this began, before Arsacid, before Rome, before the first toll was ever paid, they held the river. The river holds them now. Thank you for crossing it with me tonight. If one name or one moment from this story follows you down towards sleep, the comments are there for whenever you wake. I read them, and they decide where we travel next. The lamp is going out now. The night is yours. Rest deep and dream of slow rivers.